Hello and welcome to another episode of the Uncomplicated English Podcast. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all that the full transcript for this episode can be found for free on my website at uncomplicatedenglish.com, where I also give one-to-one conversational lessons. Also, if you are watching this video on YouTube, you can put the subtitles on by going to the settings in the bottom right-hand corner. Today, we are going to learn about a disaster that shocked the world in 1989, the Chernobyl disaster. The Chernobyl disaster was a nuclear accident that occurred at a nuclear power plant near to the city of Pripyat in what is now Ukraine. But at the time, Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. The accident started during a safety check of one of the reactors. The reactor is where the nuclear reaction takes place. The test was meant to test how the system and the staff would react if there was a power failure, if the building suddenly didn't have electricity. At the time, the government knew that the nuclear reactor might become dangerous if there was a power outage. They had run the same test 3 times before, trying to find a solution to the problem. But each time they tried, they couldn't solve the problem. What was the problem? Well, the problem was that if they were to lose power, they would not be able to keep the reactor cool. Nuclear reactors create a lot of heat and need lots of water to keep them cool and safe. But if they were to lose power, then they would have to wait for a backup generator to start working. However, it would take about 1 minute and 40 seconds before the generators started working. This was a major problem, and if the reactors were to get too hot and overheat during this time, it could create a huge problem. So, on April the 25th, another test was planned to see if they could find a solution to this problem. However, the test was delayed for 10 hours. This was the first mistake that was made. The crew, the group of people that were going to run the test, were young and inexperienced, and they didn't have enough time to get ready and prepare for the test. They switched off the emergency cooling system. This was a backup that would immediately pump water into the reactor and cool it down if it started to get too hot. During the test, the crew were meant to reduce the power of the reactor slowly. However, the power began to drop much faster than they had expected. To try and bring the power of the reactor back up, the crew decided to remove most of the control rods. The power began to rise, so the crew decided to put some more rods into the reactor to keep the power stable. However, these rods had graphite on their tips. That caused the power to rise even further. So, the power rose too quickly and rose to 10 times its usual number. It is believed that there was a steam explosion. The water in the reactor got so hot that it turned to steam, and the reactor container exploded. Nuclear material was thrown out into the air, and it began to spread out. Hot graphite exploded and landed around on the roofs of other buildings that housed other nuclear reactors. These pieces of hot graphite started to burn and start fires. If things were to get out of control, these fires could burn through the roofs and cause the reactors inside to explode. Firefighters quickly rushed to the power plant and tried to extinguish these fires. The firefighters were not told exactly what had happened and how dangerous it was for them to be so close to the fires and the exploded reactor. Some of these firefighters, like Vasily Ignatenko, who climbed up to the roof of the building to spray water onto the fire, died within a few weeks from the radiation. Radiation damages the cells of our bodies. The firefighters successfully put out all the other graphite fires by 5 a.m. However, the fire inside the reactor continued to burn, and it would only be put out on the 10th of May. The nearby city of Pripyat was not immediately evacuated. Many people carried on with their lives. However, within a few hours, many became ill. They complained that they had headaches, fits of coughing, and even vomiting. The town was only evacuated 36 hours after the explosion. This meant that thousands of people were exposed to deadly radiation. The people were told to bring only what they needed, and they would only be gone for 3 days. They were not allowed to take their pets either. The radiation levels in some places were so bad that it reached 20,000 roentgens. A lethal dose is 500. This means that a person that is exposed to 500 roentgens per second will die, and some workers in the building were exposed to 20,000 roentgens, and what is worse is that they didn't even have any protective clothing. They went into these rooms wearing normal clothes that couldn't protect them from the radiation that was there. Another terrible accident that occurred during the panic of the disaster that made it much worse was that at the nuclear plant there was only one radiation meter that could measure radiation levels of up to 1,000 roentgens. However, it was buried under rubble after the explosion. The other meters that the crew had only measured up to 3.6 roentgens per hour. This was considered at the time as not a lethal dose, and as a result, the people at the plant had no idea just how bad the levels of radiation were, and carried on working. Because of these false readings, the reactor crew chief, Alexander Akimov, didn't believe that there had been an explosion, and he stayed in the control room with his crew. He also sent some of them to pump water into the reactor to cool it down. None of them had protective clothing, and all died within 3 weeks. Whilst the fire crews were fighting the fire, they didn't realize it, but under the reactor there was a room that had filled with water. This was a big problem, because above the room, graphite was burning through the ground. If the graphite were to burn all the way through, then there would be another explosion and even more radioactive material would be released. They had to find a way to drain the water from the room. To drain the water from this room, a gate had to be opened so that the water could drain. To do this, a group of volunteers would have to go into this room and open the gates. 3 brave men volunteered. When I say that they volunteered, it means that they didn't have to do this. Nobody made them do this. They decided that they wanted to do it, to help. This was incredible, because the 3 men knew that they were going to go into a dark room where the levels of radiation were extremely high. Also, the room was completely dark and the water was up to their knees. The 3 brave volunteers successfully opened the gate and drained the water out of the room and managed to avoid a further explosion. Incredibly, 2 of these 3 men are still alive now, and the 3rd died in 2005. By December 1986, engineers had built a large concrete dome over the reactor. This meant that the level of radiation that was coming out from the reactor dropped. However, this building was only meant to last for 30 years. In 2013, a large part of its roof actually collapsed. In 2010, work had begun on a new container for the building, but was only finished in 2016. The Chernobyl disaster also had a major impact on the local environment. After the disaster, a small patch of forest downwind of the reactor turned a reddish-brown color and died. Today it is called the Red Forest because of this. Many animals died or stopped being able to reproduce. Many animals were also born with major defects. Some were born missing limbs, eyes, heads, and even ribs. However, in some parts of Chernobyl, wildlife has actually flourished because now there are no humans to hunt them and they have more space to move around in. The Chernobyl disaster is considered the worst nuclear disaster ever, and it is a constant reminder to us of the dangers of nuclear energy. It is believed that between 4,000 and 16,000 people died as a result of the accident. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. If you want to learn more about Chernobyl and also to practice your English, I recommend that you go watch the TV series called Chernobyl. It is an incredible show that shows just how terrible the accident was and how it affected the people. Thank you again, and as always, before I finish, I would like to remind you that you can find the full transcript for this episode on my website at uncomplicatedenglish.com, where I also offer one-to-one English lessons.